I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of North Carolina. And thank you so much for giving some of your time today to hear about this really moving information from our League of Women Voters of the Lower Cape Fear. I am now going to turn it over to one of the co-presidents, Marla Barthen. Marla, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that. Hi, I'm Marla Barthen. I am the co-president of the League of Women Voters down here in the Lower Cape Fear. So I live in Wilmington, and we represent Wilmington, New Hanover County, Brunswick County, and Pender County. So what we really wanted to bring forward for you today is to share some of our history, not just with our sister leagues around all the state, but also other folks that are interested in learning about 1898 and the coup d'etat that happened here in Wilmington, where several of our Black community members were massacred. And so we wanted to bring that history forward to you and invite some key people who really have a good understanding and some personal family history involved with the coup. And so I wanted to also bring to you information that we have about our own league and our own beginnings, and then how we've also worked through our continuum of change through the years in the League of Women Voters. So I will love to introduce you to our first speaker, and that's going to be Dr. Kimberly Cook. Dr. Cook is a professor of sociology and criminology at UNCW. She earned her doctorate in sociology from the University of New Hampshire in 1994. In 2001, Dr. Cook traveled to Australia and New Zealand as a Fulbright Senior Scholar to study the restorative justice divisionary programs. She has published research articles about restorative justice, wrongful convictions, shelter services for battered women, and feminist criminology. In 2004, Dr. Cook was trained in restorative practices by Kay Pranis and became a facilitator in Maine. In 2011, Dr. Cook served as an assistant chair of the Conference Committee for the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice Biennial Conference in Raleigh, North Carolina. Since 2015, Dr. Cook resumed working as a restorative justice facilitator in New Hanover County, including in juvenile court, public schools, and local nonprofit organizations. She has helped organize and facilitate restorative justice training for New Hanover County schools and helped build capacity in many schools throughout the district. Dr. Cook is especially interested in using restorative practices to promote racial and gender justice. She chairs the board of directors for LINK Incorporated, a prisoner reentry residential service, and is a founding board member for Healing Justice, offering restorative justice-based peer support and policy reform for people directly impacted by wrongful convictions. And Dr. Cook also is our co-facilitator of Wilmington Coming to the Table, which is a group that I belong to. And so that's how I most know Kimberly. So Kimberly, welcome, and I'm pleased that you're going to be able to share with us about 1898 today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marla, and thank you to all of the members of the League of Women Voters of the Lower Cape Fear. I really love your organization, and I love that you have so many great events that happen locally, focusing on different aspects of gender justice and racial justice. So kudos to you for that. I come at the study of 1898 as a member of this community, as a criminologist, as a sociologist, and as a restorative justice practitioner, all of which inform different layers of my analysis and comprehension of what happened in 1898. I want to share some slides with you to sort of go through some ideas of the Wilmington Massacre and Coup as a crime against humanity. And before I get into the concept of a crime against humanity, I want to explain my title a little bit for the session, which is Wilmington 1898, Remembering. The title is inspired by this book, The Weeping Time, by Professor Anne Bailey, who is a professor of history and particularly studies Black history. This book is about the largest slave auction in American history. And on page 172, she writes, "If racial reconciliation matters, then memory matters. If honoring your dead matters, then memory matters. If the voices of the past can empower those in the present, then memory matters." So what's important for us to take into consideration, at least from my perspective, is how we think about 1898 and how we talk about it, how we remember it. We know that 1898 included a variety of different types of crimes, including violent crime and political crime in particular. And people's communities were torn apart. People's livelihoods were stolen from them. So there was a dismembering of the community that occurred in that one event. And the purpose of this presentation is to try to reconnect some of that membering that happens in our community, our membership as a community. So I want to just plant that concept in your brains as we go through this material. So I have on the screen, coming up on the next two slides, some text. And this is the Crimes Against Humanity definition from the United Nations. Before we get to the crimes against humanity, I think it's important for us to really examine what was the community like before this crime against humanity occurred. And so for that, I'm going to invite you to think about the Black on Black project, which captures the life of African-American people in Wilmington in 1897, so before 1898. In order to understand and remember what happened in 1898, we also have to remember what 1897 looked like for the Black community. And I want to feature a couple of the people whose life stories are shared in the 1897 Black on Black project. So for that, I'm going to change the screen share to a different screen. This is the website for the Continuum of Change project, the Black on Black project Continuum historical figures. And this is a short video telling us the life of Dr. Lucy Hughes Brown. And I want to share that with you. Let me make it full screen. And then.
One of the most important figures in Wilmington history is Dr. Lucy Hughes Brown. Dr. Brown practiced medicine in Wilmington from about 1894 to 1896. Now, after that, she moved to Charleston and she helped to create the Cannon Street Hospital and Training School for Nurses, where she taught care for infants. Dr. Brown was really, really influential and important because she was the first Black woman to be licensed to practice medicine in both North and South Carolina, according to historians. So if you think about Wilmington in the mid-1890s, most populous city in North Carolina, or at least headed that way, heavy population of African Americans, this was one of the doctors that they could see. Now, the late Dr. James Francis Schobert had already made transition in 1889, so there were lots of folks who needed care, and Dr. Lucy Hughes Brown was able to fill that void.
The next one I'd like to share with you is the story of Mary Washington Howe. And here she is being introduced by her descendant, Cynthia Brown, who is with us today and will be sharing a bit more of her reflections on this story. This is a short video about Mary Washington Howe.
Well, to my family, Mary Washington Howe was my great-grandmother's auntie. In the city of Wilmington, She was a renowned educator, and especially for that era, the 19th century, she was African-American female, not just a scholar, but a leader. And she was the first female African-American principal in this city of a school. She was principal at Williston Grammar School, and that was before the Williston Senior High and Junior High and the other formats for Williston came forth. Mary Washington Howe was a tremendous influence on educators who came after her. Her emphasis was on scholarship first. She believed that you couldn't teach the children effectively and holistically unless you were well educated yourself. But she also believed that leadership was critical to taking a team of educators forward, helping them understand the needs of the children, and bringing the families, the community, and the young people together in their realm, in their scope of understanding what was needed. So she was multi-dimensional, if you will, multifaceted in her view of education. And she made that impact on future educators by walking the talk. She didn't just have the experience that her father afforded her. She didn't just attain the positions and move forward to become a principal, but she showed through her work and through her conscientiousness what future educators should also be doing. Alfred Augustus Howe was the youngest son of the man we know as the first African brought to America as a slave, unfortunately. His name was Anthony Walker. He was sold as an asset to the Howe plantation. And Anthony Walker, his African name was Iboto, as it was recorded, was a builder. And his father back in Africa taught him craftsmanship and building. He passed that along to his sons. And of his sons, Alfred was the most successful. He became a staunch businessman here in Wilmington. He was commissioned to build not only in the local area, but he traveled to the West Indies to build. And he was well regarded amongst the, quote, trained architects in the city. There are several buildings that stand today that can be attributed to Alfred Howe's craftsmanship. He also left beyond family values the legacy of education, whether formal or if it was informal, through passing along a trade or a craft. And he made it a point to help his children understand the importance of collaboration. If others are willing to work together for the betterment of all, that's what we must do. If not, we must pool our resources and our knowledge and our abilities to bring our people forward. And he lived a life that was very illustrative of those concepts. Those are some of the legacies that he passed along in his family and also in the community.
And that portrait is on was on display. It's part of the Continuum of Change project. So I want to go back to the screen share. There's other stories on that website, and I would strongly encourage you to look at all of the videos. We don't have time to show all of them, but I did want to feature those two because I think that they are excellent examples of the rich, diverse, accomplished excellence that was being developed here in the Black community. So the Black on Black project has done a wonderful job of really capturing, and will continue to capture, I imagine, over time, more evidence of how the dislocation of 1898 impacted the community that existed and what that community consisted of before the dislocation, the crushing dislocation of Wilmington in 1898. I would especially encourage you to take into consideration watching the video about Galloway, Miller, and Manley in particular. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about crimes against humanity as a definition from the United Nations. We're going to talk about the crimes in 1898 here in Wilmington, particularly the coup d'etat and the massacre. We're going to talk about dislocation and dismembering of the community that existed prior to 1898 and since. We're going to also talk about the possibility of truth and reconciliation. And I hope that you find it helpful. And I would ask you to maybe hold your questions or put your questions in the chat and hold your questions until we've heard from our discussants as well. We have Cynthia Brown here to present her experiences as a descendant. And we also have Frankie Roberts, who is the executive director of a local nonprofit organization, Link, which he will also share his thoughts on this material and these experiences. So this is a lot of text, and I don't expect you to read it all, which is why I put key phrases in red. The United Nations defines crimes against humanity as any of the following acts when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against a civilian population. These things include murder. They also include enslavement, and 1898 wasn't explicitly about enslavement as an economic structure, but we'll talk about that in a second. The deportation or forced transfer of the population, and then persecution against political, racial, or ethnic and cultural groups in the city, and then the crime of apartheid, which is the forced separation of people based on ethnic groupings, and other inhumane acts as of a similar character intentionally causing great suffering. So we know that these are things that absolutely happened in Wilmington in 1898, and they certainly seem to match the definition of the United Nations crimes against humanity. Elements of the crimes against humanity during peacetime include the contextual element of when it's committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against a civilian population. And that was definitely part of how things unfolded in Wilmington in 1898. And with knowledge of the attack, there were people who planned it. So this was a deliberate attack on the community of Wilmington at the time, with a particular goal toward establishing a white supremacist government and white supremacist community. So this included large-scale violence against a number of victims in a geographic region, and a methodical use of violence as well. And here in Wilmington, the crimes against humanity are committed in furtherance of the state or organizational policy, because we know that the state of North Carolina was involved in carrying out this coup and the massacre in different ways. We also would identify the state of North Carolina as complicit in, under this definition of crimes against humanity, complicit in bearing responsibility for how things unfolded. Any issues that you have with this definition, we can talk about during the Q&A time. We also know that there's a bigger backdrop to the 1898 events and to the community that was dismembered and disrupted during the 1898 events. We know that this place that we call home here in Wilmington and southeastern North Carolina is the original home of the Catawba people, and that we have a long-standing, hundreds of years of history where the colonization of this land has perpetuated a genocide against Indigenous people. We also know that part of the backdrop of Wilmington and the United States is a backdrop of enslavement. We heard a couple of mentions of that today in the short videos that we just watched. And here is an ad to capture a runaway enslaved man named George, to the family of the Moors in Moors Creek, which is not very far from here. So the backdrop includes the types of dislocation and destruction that existed in terms of Indigenous people being forced out, and then also the types of damage done to families and communities torn apart through the practice of enslavement. And so these histories shape how Wilmington developed and then how Wilmington was scarred. We know, of course, that during Reconstruction here in Wilmington, we saw a thriving Black community, particularly with builders and skilled craftspeople, educational and economic opportunities. We saw successful bankers, we saw successful politicians, we saw successful educational leaders such as Mary Washington Howe and others. We've seen many people from the Black community really thrive during the period of Reconstruction, which then, of course, led to some white supremacist resentment. Mulrooney, in her book, Race, Place, and Memory, writes that when the Civil War ended, Black Wilmingtonians celebrated with jubilation while Alfred Moore Waddell, who would later become one of the instigators of the massacre and coup, observed an elderly white man reacting with horror and disgust. So there were two different sets of reactions in Wilmington at the end of the Civil War, as you can imagine, based on people's position with regard to the practice of enslavement. In Wilmington, after the Civil War and through Reconstruction, signs of Black progress were everywhere, from successful businesses to successful banking to successful craftsmanship to a flourishing arts community and a flourishing musical community here in the area, particularly among the Black population. But a white supremacy campaign took hold, and it didn't let up. We know that there was the political crime of the overthrow of the duly elected government. There was an election on November 8th, which resulted in a fusion government being established here in Wilmington that was representative of the population of Black leaders as well as white leaders. It was a fusion between within the Republican Party and Black leaders here. We know that there was also violent crime that occurred as part of the effort to overthrow the government. There was also a lot of violence inflicted. We know people were murdered. We know that there was quite a lot of severe dislocation of Black citizens, and the actual toll, the massive amount of harm done in Wilmington during that violent crime spree, that mass murder spree, will never really fully be known because some of the historical record is incomplete. And while many people are working to sort of scour through the historical documentation to clear up some of the hidden pieces of this history, the actual full scope of the harm from the violent crime may never be known, but we do know that many people were murdered, many people were driven out of town, many people hid in Pine Forest Cemetery, many people had to pull together their family resources and ended up leaving Wilmington, and those who stayed in a state of fear that this might happen again. There was intense property crime. So there was theft of property, there was theft of businesses. There was, of course, the burning of the Daily Record, which is the local paper that was published by Alex Manley and his brother. We know that that remains now a vacant lot. So there were definitely property crimes. Properties were taken over, and we know that the victims were primarily and almost exclusively Black citizens in Wilmington who were up until that point experiencing the thriving Reconstruction economy, which helped them to participate in civic life. We know that there were perpetrators. We know their names, and there's a lot that has been written about the perpetrators and some of the known victims. And the perpetrators have never really been brought to justice. In fact, they benefited pretty handsomely from the crimes that they committed. So this is a quote from Waddell, that they would resist Negro rule of the fusion government if we have to choke the current of the Cape Fear River with carcasses. This is a famous quote. We almost always hear it. No one could have stopped the coming attack. And this is from Mulrooney's book, Race, Place, and Memory. And it was a day of blood, according to Lorraine Umfleet's study, and the type of massacre that occurred, and then the political impact has continued. So the impacts are what I want to talk about next. We know that when family members experience a murdered loved one, or a loved one being murdered, there is a complex grief that goes along with that murder, and a fear that that murder might occur with other loved ones in their family or other members of their community. So the dismembering meant these people were taken out of their families and taken out of their communities. Businesses were destroyed, livelihoods were stolen, faith communities lost members, remaining families never forgot. One of the things that Cynthia Brown once told me, and perhaps she'll have a chance to talk about this, is that her grandmother told her when she was a child that something terrible happened here. And truly something terrible did happen here. Another element of the impacts of the 1898 massacre and coup is that there became a diaspora of people fleeing Wilmington, particularly African-American family members fleeing Wilmington, or family groups fleeing Wilmington and settling in other places because of how things unfolded here. And for those that fled, they took their talents and their skills with them, and therefore the local economy and the local community could no longer benefit from their talents and skills, and they were no longer able to achieve their life goals here in this area because of the impacts of 1898. So the families that relocated in many other places around the country. There was apparently a group of people who settled in New York City. There were groups of people that settled in various places in New Jersey, in Philadelphia, in Washington, D.C. And so this is a diaspora from 1898. And then the local economy lost much of the vitality that they took with them. Right, so the dislocations, I think, are really important to acknowledge and understand. The determination, the innovation, the creativity was from those that left was squandered here in Wilmington. Those who remained in Wilmington, but had very strict limitations placed on their capacity to thrive. And yet they found ways to thrive. I recently toured the museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And at the top level, there is, thankfully, a beautiful display titled "Making a Way Out of No Way." And in it is about the resilience and the creativity. And we have that here in Wilmington as well. We continue to benefit from those who are able to make a way out of no way. So here in Wilmington, almost overnight, the coup transformed Wilmington from an American Mecca for Blacks to a bastion of white supremacy, virulently hostile to Black citizens. This is a quote from David Zucchino's book, Wilmington's Lie. And he also documents that the Black population in Wilmington fell from 56% before the massacre and coup within 100 years to under 20% by 2018, within 120 years. So the impacts was that we have squandered an opportunity to benefit from the life and livelihood and innovation of people who were creative and hardworking and committed to excellence. So what would truth and reconciliation look like? First of all, for us to have a truth and reconciliation process here in Wilmington, we need to have truth first, right? So we need to have an examination and an understanding of the grief and loss, which is continuing in Wilmington. The impact of the 1898 massacre and coup hasn't ended. So the grief and loss is exacerbated by reverence for the old Confederacy, which is one of the reasons why the conversation about the Confederate monuments has been so impassioned. And then the frustrated lack of accountability. You know, it's frustrated by the lack of accountability in terms of who's taking responsibility for what happened. And I know that the people who perpetrated the coup are no longer alive, but the generational wealth that was stolen and then transferred to descendants continues to be part of our landscape in this place. And so it continues to impact not only where we live, but how we live where we live. Historical trauma is important. I'm a trauma researcher, and I'm studying historical trauma as well as contemporary trauma. So the historical trauma of the Wilmington 1898 massacre and coup continues. We know through research, biological research and genetic research, that the impact of trauma gets passed on genetically in the DNA of descendants. And so when somebody is a victim of trauma, they are then also passing that trauma on to their descendants through the altered DNA in their bodies. There's a lot that we could talk about. If there's questions about that, we can have that conversation. We also know, as Sean Ginwright, who is a scholar of education, has written in his book, Hope and Healing in Urban Education, that what we see in Wilmington is not a post-traumatic stress response. What we see in Wilmington is rather a persistent traumatic stress environment. So the persistent traumatic stress environment for people who have inherited this coup and massacre and the impacts of it continues to be a source of struggle, as well as a source of how they cope with everyday life in Wilmington. The contemporary effects, you know, since the 1998 commemorations of the centennial anniversary, we have seen memorials and markers go up. We have had some efforts from private citizens to make amends. We have had some, I think one of the people involved in the 1898 commemoration at the centennial marking was a descendant of George Roundtree, who was one of the perpetrators. We've also seen some efforts made by private citizens who are descendants of perpetrators to make efforts toward trying to set things better, if not right. And we can talk about that as well. So I don't want to diminish the fact that those things, there's been fits and starts in that over the course of time. Is reconciliation possible? I think for reconciliation to happen, there needs to be truth. Truth comes before reconciliation. So whenever we talk about a truth and reconciliation process, you almost never hear reconciliation and then truth, because that's not the process. The process is tell the truth, acknowledge the harm, understand the harm from the perspective of those who have carried the harm, and then understand the scope of the damage done. So the scope of the damage done means that the Black community that existed in Wilmington in 1897 was forever altered by the events of 1898. And we have to understand that. The opposite of trauma is not healing. The opposite of trauma, according to Danielle Sered in her book, Until We Reckon, is that the opposite of trauma is power, because trauma diminishes power, right? So trauma is a sense of powerlessness. You can't resist, you can't deny, you can't avoid and evade the harm that's caused during a traumatic life event or a series of traumatic life events, and particularly true with historical trauma of enslavement, historical trauma of genocide, historical trauma of different types of crimes against humanity. The opposite of trauma is power, in the sense that if we're going to have a reconciliation process, we need to tell the truth and we need to empower the people who have been historically disempowered. Repair. So in the 2006 report from the commission, the 1898 Commemoration Commission, which can be found online, and we can drop a link to that in the chat for those that want to read it. There were a series of recommendations around education, around the economy, around commemoration, and around moving forward, I think was the fourth one. There were four elements of those recommendations. They were recommendations that the state should engage, because the state was partly responsible for this, that the state should engage in efforts to repair the harms of 1898. Unfortunately, most of those recommendations have not been fulfilled by the state of North Carolina. There have been some movements in that direction, but they haven't necessarily come from the state. There have been 2 reparations petitions prepared. One comes from our local chapter of Coming to the Table, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I also want to talk about remembering. Some families remain dislocated and uprooted from their Wilmington roots. It's important to know who you are, to know that you belong, to know where your people came from. All of those things are about bringing you into membership in a community, that I belong here. I belong in this community. If your people had been in generations prior, dislocated, disrupted, forced out of town, maimed, killed, then that membership suddenly comes into question. The membership in that community comes into question. So you often wonder, where do I fit? Do I have a home here? Can I live peacefully here? Can I live a life here with a livelihood and with security here? So to be made whole as a community requires a remembering, a rejoining of that community to be made whole for the purposes of telling the truth and acknowledging the harm and acknowledging the impact, and then creating a strategy of making amends that is informed by those who are the survivors of the people who were harmed. There are current efforts taking shape to achieve some of these goals, but they're not being done necessarily by the state of North Carolina. And I want to highlight some of them. We have the New Hanover County Community Remembrance Project, which is part of the equal justice initiatives. That's why that image is in the logo. The Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama is an initiative that tries to document and commemorate all of the lynching victims in the United States, the racial terror lynching victims in the United States. And the Equal Justice Initiative acknowledges that the victims of the 1898 massacre are lynching victims. In their memorial, they have a display of jars, glass gallon jars with the names of the person who was lynched etched on the jars, and soil inside the jars collected from the locations where those lynchings occurred. We have the Community Remembrance Project here in New Hanover County, and on November 6th, I would invite you to come and participate. We will be doing a soil collection ceremony at the 1898 memorial to commemorate the known victims of those who, of the people who were murdered, the known murder victims of 1898, and then a jar that will commemorate the unknown victims, because there are many more that have not been identified. So the Community Remembrance Project is one of the current efforts that we have going on. We also have the third person. Oh, and I should say the Community Remembrance Project is co-chaired by Jim Downey and Tim Pinnock. And I'm a member of that, and several of us here have been involved in that. The Third Person Project, which is from John Jeremiah Sullivan and Joel Finzel, is an effort to reconstruct the content of the Daily Record, which was the newspaper published by Alex Manley and his brother in the late 1890s, and then of course destroyed during the coup and massacre. So reconstructing that. They're also looking to do a lot of work of historical research and various elements of the events surrounding 1898. And when they're ready to announce some of the details of that, be on the lookout for that. This is a group of us at Pine Forest Cemetery. You'll see in the picture Tim Pinnock standing behind me. You'll see Cynthia Brown standing a little bit further back. And then you'll see John Sullivan kind of leaning his head in, and you'll see Joel Finzel holding a cup of coffee in the background, and then Jim Downey with the Black Lives Matter t-shirt on. And that's a coalition of people from the New Hanover County Community Remembrance Project and the Third Person Project collaborating with one another to conduct some research. And then we have the 1898 Massacre and Coup d'etat Observance Group, which is also going to be planning some events during November for the 1898 commemoration. And then we have our local chapter of Coming to the Table. Coming to the Table is a national restorative justice nonprofit organization to bring people together to have discussions about the ongoing impact of enslavement in our country and the continuing need to have an honest dialogue about that. So it brings together people who are descended from enslaved people and people like me who are descended from enslavers to have an honest conversation about the impact in our communities and in our society and ways to take action to promote racial justice and promote reparations. And we also here in New Hanover County have the benefit of the YWCA, which is working on eliminating racism and empowering women in the Lower Cape Fear region. And we also have the League of Women Voters of the Lower Cape Fear doing a lot of the similar work. So kudos to you all. So resilience and healing. The disaster of 1898 left visible scars here. We see our city is pockmarked by these vacant lots, like the vacant lot where the Daily Record once stood, by the underdevelopment in certain neighborhoods, such as the North Side. The North Side has been attempting to, has been due for a grocery store for many years, and that still has not taken shape. We do have, however, a resilient community effort called the Northside Food Co-op, building a food co-op on Princess Street, and there will be a store called Frankie's, which is named for Frankie Roberts, and we'll maybe talk about that. We still have segregated schools or resegregated schools because the desegregation movement in Wilmington was another period of disaster that continued to inflict damage along this fault line of racism and racial injustice, and particularly systemic racism. And that led to, of course, then the wrongful conviction of the Wilmington 10. We've had segregated businesses. We've had lack of economic investment and economic opportunity for Black businesses. We also have invisible scars. I want to read a quote to you from this book, Narrative, Political Unconsciousness and Racial Violence in Wilmington by Professor Leslie Hosfeld, who did this wonderful research project that I think doesn't get enough attention on the stories and what we tell ourselves about 1898. So she's asking the question, how do historical events impact social relations long after the event? And in it, she documents that the story of Blacks drowning in the Cape Fear River was commonly used by whites to intimidate Blacks for decades, and that the stories circulate in communities. And so when you have people of color, particularly African-American people, remembering the ways in which some white people would taunt them with the bodies of Black dead people floating down the Cape Fear River as a threat of compliance was chilling, because it really happened and it was really damaging. We also have Black citizens who remained here or moved to Wilmington, who have been striving for success and excellence in education and business and political life and sports and other endeavors. And you know, we've been able to point to a lot of Black excellence that exists in spite of these pressures, in spite of the fact that the coup has never been overturned. Resilience among the Black communities is celebrated. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the rich and wonderful history of Williston High School, which was known as by the Alumni Association as the greatest school under the sun. And the exemplars of excellence here in Wilmington include Ms. Bertha Todd, right? And her chalkboard, she's a famous educator in town. All children smile in the same language, and amen to that. And we know that we benefited from the talents of Althea Gibson, who was coached by Coach Eaton, right? We know that we've had the benefits of Williston High School, which was a high school devoted to educational excellence. We know that we have now the benefit of Frankie Roberts in our community, who is an award-winning and inspiring leader. He is a certified living legend based on an award he received a few years ago. And he's just doing wonderful things to make our community a richer place and a better place for people, for all people, not only for people of color. And then we have Evelyn Bryant, who is on the board of directors of the YWCA and also on the board of directors of LINC with us. And she is also involved in so much work going on in the community with respect to health equity, especially, and she was very actively involved in the discussions around the impact of the sale of the hospital. We have Rebecca Trammell, who is one of the most energetic people in our community, and she has a group called Community Conversations and another group called Champions of Compassion, where she particularly is looking at trying to encourage the school system to become better at racial equity in the school system and racial justice in the school system. We have Gerard and Tracy Newkirk, who have the Genesis Block business incubator, particularly for minority and women-owned businesses. And they are doing an amazing amount of work at helping to support young businesses get off the ground and succeed and thrive. We have the Wilmington 10 Foundation. I mentioned the Wilmington 10 earlier, for social justice. We also have Deborah Dix Maxwell, who is the president of our local chapter of the NAACP, and she has, been one of the most vocal advocates for voting rights and for voter participation. We have Sonia Patrick, who runs the National Black Lives Leadership Caucus here in the area, as well as our local chapter of Black Lives Matter. And she's been, of course, very active in commemorating, truthfully commemorating the events surrounding 1898. We have Ashley Daniels, who is a leader in New Hanover for All and has been very active in terms of environmental justice, as well as trying to combat environmental racism. And of course, with the Gen X in the water, that's been a huge issue in our community. And then we have these two beautiful women, Cynthia Brown, who is, you're going to hear from later, and Letty Elizabeth, who is a local historian and runs an amazing podcast called History Shows Us, and linking the current situation with our historical roots. And so if you're looking for her podcast, it is called History Shows Us by Letty Elizabeth. And so look for that. And then we know that Martin Luther King said the moral arc of the universe is long and it bends towards justice. And I'm here to tell you it doesn't bend on its own. It bends because people are pulling it towards justice, because people are advocating for justice, because people are using their talents and their passions and their skills to continue the push toward justice, which we're not done with. So our contemporary reckoning includes the reality that the 1898 massacre and coup is a contested memory. So for nearly 100 years, the main narrative of 1898 stemmed around a white supremacist claim of a race riot. The subordinated narratives among African-American communities became more prominent after the centennial, and I think are more important and more accurate than the white supremacist commemoration or memories. We also have some related reckonings, right? So the removal of the Confederate monuments and the renaming of Longleaf Park. We have the Black Lives Do Matter mural and other public art going on. We have the McNeil Boulevard named. We have the Love Grove Road Project. We have a variety of different ways in which racial justice is being advocated for and being pursued. And we have some of these victories that I think are significant to acknowledge. We also have, from a restorative justice lens, which is one of the lenses that I bring to this discussion, to really have an honest reckoning, we need the voices of those who have been harmed to be at the center of the discussion. We need to acknowledge the harms done by the descendants of the perpetrators, particularly those who have tried to deny the importance of the 1898 events. That was a long time ago, get over it, it doesn't matter anymore. Well, it does still matter. It does still matter because the coup has not been overturned. We need active accountability for those who sustained the coup. We need material and symbolic reparations to the direct descendants of the victims by the city, by the county, and by the state. And we need a clear investment in economic vitality, educational reform, and health equity, and other things. We need to do it because it's time. This is a photograph of Jeff Ward, a colleague of mine at Washington University and a descendant of the Howe family here in Wilmington, and Cynthia Brown and me at the Dare Coulter sculpture on UNCW's campus, commemorating the 1898 events and celebrating resilience and strength in the Black community here in Wilmington. And here is a photograph that, because it's time, we have to celebrate and embrace Black lives do matter, and that it's time to end racism now. Thank you.
Gosh, thank you, Kim, so much. I'm taking a deep breath before I even begin to speak because there's so much there's so much that I'm taking in what you said and how we're going to move forward in this next portion. I want to once again show that lovely picture I saw of Cynthia Brown and you just recently at the 1897 art exhibit. Let me do that really quickly because it was lovely smiles and lovely hi there. Hope everyone can see that, but the two of you are just wonderful. I just love that picture. So let me thank you again for that. And I'm going to move on to Cynthia Brown because I want to be able to link our stories together. And so I think that you've laid out a really good foundation of where we can go next. So Cynthia Brown is a native of Wilmington, North Carolina. She's the eldest of 3 siblings and 6th generation descendant of the noted Wilmington designer and builder Alfred and Augustus Howe. Both Cynthia's parents were educators, and this influenced her interest in history. She is an alumna of the UNC Chapel Hill and Loyola University in Chicago, holding a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's degree in industrial relations. She continued her postgraduate studies at UCLA's Anderson School of Business as a Johnson & Johnson Corporation Management Fellow, and was also certified by the UNC Chapel Hill's Institute of Government as a municipal administrator. Her career spans 40 years as a human resource administrator, nonprofit administrator, and educator. She's authored 2 books and penned articles for professional journals. And I have to say, she also did a great interview with the Washington Post. She didn't put it in here, but I just have to probably link that somewhere in our chat. She currently serves as an archivist and historian for St. Stephen's AME Church in Wilmington, North Carolina, now in its 156th year of continuous operation. And she is the archivist and historian for a graduate chapter of the Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated in Wilmington. She's a member of the Society of American Archivists and has received civic awards and commendations for her engagement in community affairs in Wilmington and the state of North Carolina. In 2021, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority awarded her its prestigious Elizabeth Schmoke Randolph Civic Award from the Mid-Atlantic region of the US for her selfless and ongoing community service. She's a wife, mother, and grandmother, and enjoys photography, gardening, quilting in her spare time. So I just wanted you to get a full picture of Cynthia. Cynthia, I asked specifically to come to share not only her family story, but then also another chapter in her family story. So I will let her take it away and do that for us.
Okay, and thank you, Marla, and thank you, Kim, as well as to your entire audience for having me today. I realize time is of the essence today, and so I'm going to stay very focused on providing you with more information about my family, our experience, etc. And as it relates to many of the components of Dr. Cook's presentation. Marla and I met briefly in another setting, and I made mention of how my family learned of the 1898 massacre as it was passed down, and how I passed it along at an event here in Wilmington. And she asked me to share that with you today. And it made me think about 3 S's: secrets, survival, and then success, or striving for success. So what I'd like to do first and foremost is read to you a little excerpt from a writing that I did about a few years ago during a time when I was in a very reflective stage. I was moving from one stage of life to another, one career to another. And in this little writing, this book, I included a chapter, a brief chapter,
entitled A Glimpse into the Past and a Vision for the Future. And I felt some excerpts from this chapter would be one of the best and most succinct ways to share with you my feelings about what happened, how I've passed the story along, how my father, his mother, and his grandmother held the secret out of fear, and what hope I have for the future. So let me start out, and I'm just going to pull some little snippets and run through sections, not read this at all in entirety. But I write about my frustration as a child because as a young girl, we visited my great-grandmother, Athalia Howe, when she was in failing health, living in Pennsylvania with her daughter, one of her daughters. I was perhaps at that time less than 10 years old. And during that visit, I went to her bedside and she grabbed my wrist. And in a very panicked and almost fearful way, she kept saying to me, "Don't let this happen to you. If it ever happens to you, run." And not understanding what she was talking about, I thought, well, Grandma Louise is taking care of Grandma Thalia, great-grandma Thalia. And I thought, she's just not thinking clearly. But my father was very angry. He immediately looked across the room at my mother and instructed her to take me and my brother out of the room. And at that time, I didn't understand what was happening. But many years later, before my high school graduation, he explained that my great-grandmother had experienced a very horrible event in Wilmington's history, that it had been hidden for many, many decades, that she didn't talk about it. And for whatever reason, she was compelled to share it with me, a child in grade school. And he didn't want me to know because he felt it was too overwhelming a history for me to know. Well, he still didn't tell me everything. So one of my dear friends and I made a visit to the library where we were denied access to any information about the 1898 coup and massacre. And I left in the spring or summer, June of 1973 for college saying, I will find out what this was all about one way or the other. Well, I did. And what I found out was that on the morning of the event, my great-grandmother witnessed a man being shot as he left his home on North Fifth Avenue, walking down a dirt walkway to get to work, presumably on the docks. Her father, William C. Howe, worked on the docks and was a barrel maker. And many of the men had already left for work. But what I also learned was that for weeks, those same men who would hunt in the nearby woods and countryside for rabbit or deer, other wild meats for food, really, were unable to get ammunition. And as a result, could not defend themselves on the morning of November 10th, 1898. My great-grandmother, as she was on her deathbed, wanted to make sure that the eldest in the generation would know something. And my father, by the time of my high school graduation, decided he should tell me more, but he still didn't tell me the whole story. Those secrets stayed with the family for another decade or two before they completely unraveled. And so from my little writing, A Metamorphosis of the Soul, I want to share some excerpts from the chapter I mentioned. And it reads as thus: for years, the incident was not openly discussed until a time when I returned to Wilmington and community organizers and leaders planned and executed a centennial commemoration of the event. It was quite successful and was followed by the erection of a public memorial to the victims of this horrible event, the opening of a public dialogue to begin a healing process, and numerous scholarly books, historical fiction and nonfiction alike, that were published. In the process, many family documents and a great deal of hidden history were illuminated, but it still wasn't enough. Reflecting on my great-grandmother's life, she remained in Wilmington after the incident, and as a young woman, she went into domestic service and began raising her own family, later assisting with her grandchildren. She worked for many years as a cook for the Parsley family on Masonboro Sound. Over time, my father would come to share wonderful stories about his grandmother's cooking, his love of seafood from the Sound, and the few occasions on which he was allowed with his brother, David Anthony, to visit the Parsley residence on Masonboro, known as Live Oaks. When I returned to Wilmington in 1993, I decided to feed my appetite for local history. And I'll pause there and just tell you that I did so by spending a great deal of time at Pine Forest Cemetery, which was actually a ritual for me growing up. My mother, very ritualistically, each year, each holiday, insisted that we visit the cemetery to visit the grave sites of family members, but she would tell us more of her family's history, and her family was not rooted in New Hanover County. My father's family roots are resting in the Howes family, in the Howe family tree, I'll say. And so he was not here. And I want to stop and interject that point. He was not here to tell us all of the stories because over time, his fear of the inability to succeed in Wilmington outweighed his desire to stay in place and continue in the family. And as a teenager, I experienced the trauma of divorce with my parents, but fortunately they both remarried. They remarried wonderful people, and we all had wonderful relationships. But a part of his fear rested in his grandmother's stories about what happened, his growing up somewhat impoverished in Wilmington, his leaving to join the Air Force, then later playing baseball and actually playing with the Negro League, but going on to college, studying, returning as an educator, and that quest to continue on with his education conflicted with the fears of whether he as an African American could truly succeed in Wilmington. He went on to medical school and became a quite successful family practice physician, but decided he could never return to Wilmington because he felt that the trauma of Wilmington's past and the ghost of Wilmington that haunted the town in the present day would not permit him and many others to come back. So there were many in his generation and the generation before who left. Well, fast forwarding, after my return here and talking further with him about what happened, I found myself serving on the Historic Wilmington Foundation's Board of Directors and befriended the former executive director, George Edwards. George is a wonderful person and we became very good friends. And I decided I would help with the fundraiser in 2010. And lo and behold, to my surprise, it was scheduled for Masonboro Sound at Live Oaks, the former, well, it was still at that time, the Parsley estate. I understand it has since been sold. So returning to my writing, I recorded that there was a part of me that did not want to attend. The remembrance of my father's stories about his grandmother, although some of those stories were positive, left a very uneasy feeling in my soul. And I had very mixed emotions, but something deep down said go. My husband became ill that afternoon with a cough, mild fever. It was the fall of the year. And I said, you know what? This is time now for me to pass the history forward to my middle child, my younger son. I have 2 sons and a daughter. He could fit his dad's tuxedo. And I said, you're coming with me. There's a history lesson for you to learn tonight. And what better way than to take you to a place where some of the history happened. I can take you to other parts of Wilmington and tell you more, but this place is a place you should come to tonight. And so we went. We met the matriarch of the family, who was in a wheelchair that night, and greeting all of the guests for the gala at the door, and had a few exchanges of pleasantries. And then we walked the grounds, and I talked under a full moon that night. And I tell you, it was a full moon, and I could see the reflection shimmering in the water off on the edge of the grounds. And we talked intensely about what happened here. We talked about why members of our family left and where some of them may have landed. And at that point, I still had not made the connection with other members of the Howe family tree, different branches. My son was somewhat in awe, and for a moment couldn't understand why we chose to leave Illinois, where he had so many cultural outlets and he enjoyed his friends, and why we decided to come back, to come to Wilmington, a place that held so many dreaded remembrances for our family. But I explained to him that when my mother passed away very suddenly, and my father asked me to come back and be the keeper of family history and help the community as it gathered and unearthed old history, that I felt an obligation to do so. And missing the Field Museum and the Museum of Art and Science and all of the features and fun places that Chicago holds would not hurt him or his brother or his sister, but that coming back here would enrich them for a different point in time. I left the Parsley residence that night less concerned about the fact that my great-grandmother Athalia was once the family cook, and that she hid in Pine Forest Cemetery for nights after the 1898 massacre. It was more important to me that roughly 100 years later, her great-granddaughter and a great-great-grandson, whom she never lived to meet, could be on the guest list and be coordinators for a fundraiser at the residence. In spite of all the work still to be done in society, some progress has been made, but definitely not enough. Telling a part of the family history to my son, and in the place where some of it occurred, made the history lesson more relevant. And I could tell from his reaction, better appreciate it. In the spirit, I felt that my great-grandmother Athalia's presence was there that night. I had received an opportunity to visit a chapter in my family's past and to take my son with me. Although he was not the eldest in the generation as I knew that he would be the new keeper of history for the family. My parents always taught me that you must know your history to understand where you're attempting to go, or possibly where you don't want to go back to. On this occasion, I was able to help him see the relevance of his past to his potential in the present to make positive impact, and then to look beyond the present to the unlimited potential of our futures. My soul was lifted, and I had a divine assurance that the legacy of documenting, preserving, and telling our family's history would not be lost to the winds of time. There was no longer a reason to be fearful. That evening, one of our children paused to look with me back into the past and set his compass for a good course. I was also reminded of the responsibility we all have to know ourselves, our past and our present, and be truthful with ourselves. With that knowledge, we can confidently stand in the present, boldly walk into the future, and responsibly build our children's and our neighbors' children's self-esteem in the knowledge of who they are. And this will not only transform our souls, but it will shape the souls of our next generation. Those are some of the reflections that I have on what happened here, and a part of what I shared with Marla when we originally met. And I thought it would be the most succinct way for me to share with you my feelings about what has happened in Wilmington in the past, what we must all do to work together to ensure it never happens again, and that we must also work with our neighbors' children. We should be our brothers and our sisters' keepers. because those children who don't know their history and their legacy will be robbed of self-esteem, and they won't have that confidence to go forth into the future. So those are my thoughts that I wanted to share. And thank you for having me.
Always, thank you. It was so important for me, for you both to be here as a participant of our coming to the table here in Wilmington, which I encourage you, if you have a local branch of that, for you all to consider coming to the table with other folks in your community, because it was a rich and has been a rich and rewarding experience for me. And I came to that group with this question about how do we talk about the history of the League of Women Voters, and specifically here in Lower Cape Fear. How do we do that? Because I was very interested in truth and reconciliation. And so talking it through, we really were able to have some perspective, and Cynthia's words were really powerful for me as she was talking about going to Live Oaks and at the Parsley family home and what that was like. And so I'm just going to open it up and say the words out loud, because I really truly believe that we cannot change what we don't acknowledge. So I'm going to skip my bio because we don't have enough time for that, and I want to be able to get to the meat of what we're doing. But I will say that I'm heavily involved in equity in our community. You'll see me pretty much in lots of places, and I am very proud to say that there are many people that we put on the screen today, whether in picture or in person, who I am glad to be able to call my friends and colleagues. So
Can we invite Frankie to do a couple?
Is he still here? I thought I saw him pop off of there, but yeah, sure. If he's here, please.
Frankie, have you been able to stay?
Certainly unmute yourself if you're here.
Oh, there he is.
Yeah,
Okay.
Hi, Frankie.
well,
So-
I'm just here as a support for Kim and Cynthia. So I know you probably want to get to some questions. So I just want to say I'm glad to be here to hear Kim and Cynthia. It's always enlightening and above all inspiring. So thank you for having me.
Well, Frankie is the co-facilitator with me for our local chapter of Coming to the Table, and we have had some really great meetings in that chapter. So I would encourage you to consider joining if you're interested in joining our local chapter or joining a local chapter wherever you are.
Thank you for that very much. I'm going to pop into our screen share, if it's going to let me do that, to give a little context on women's suffrage, because not everybody here is familiar with the League of Women Voters or the history of the League of Women Voters. And of course, we do have lots of League folks here from all over the state, and I think nationally as well. So it is known to us that women's suffrage did have issues with disenfranchising Black women during that time. And we did win the vote in 1920. However, it did take us till the civil rights movement in the 1960s before Black women were then enfranchised, and we were able to really say that there were voting rights for all. So I do have to say that out loud. And when I asked Cynthia to talk with us about the Parsley family home, it's because I wanted to be able to have a place for us to talk about Mrs. Parsley and Agnes Parsley. She is the wife of Walter Parsley, who happened to be one of the Secret Nine, one of the organizers of the coup d'etat, and also the sister of Hugh McCrae. She happens to be the first president we have of our local league here in Lower Cape Fear, of the League of Women Voters. So that was in 1921. And as you can see, I put a picture up here of the famous parades that folks will see of the women's marches that happened in Washington. And during the time of those marches, there were the Southern coalitions who really did not want Black women to march. They wanted them to be segregated and march in the back. And there are some famous folks, especially Ida B. Wells, who said no to that. Let me skip back there. Who said no to that. And she interjected herself right into her Chicago contingent, and she marched along with. So it was an issue. And I will say the Southern Coalition leaders did end up forming a lot of the local leagues. And so there was a lot of that thread of white supremacy that did run through with the League of Women Voters as well. And we did see that here. And I can't tell you personally what the values were of Agnes Parsley. I can just tell you who her family was. And her sister-in-law was actually the founder of the North Carolina, I think it was coalition of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So they did have a piece in there. So I just wanted to be able to say that we don't know that much about her personally, but we do know a bit about the family. And so unfortunately, I don't have a picture of her to show. But I will say that we did go defunct, just like many other leagues, through the Great Depression and World War II. So there were some of them who went dormant, and ours was like that. And we tried to revive again back in the 60s. And, certainly in the civil rights movement, we did try to revive our local league, but we had a great historian and first president of our league back in the 70s, who was able to go back and explain that. And so as we tried to revamp our league, we actually had, we have rules that you cannot be politically active for one party or the other. You have to be nonpartisan. And so we were not able to be nonpartisan because we had so many of our people in the league that were politically active and were either running for office, held office, or their husbands were running for office or held office. So that is why we did not form the league back in the 60s, but we did able to get that restarted for us in 1971. And then we were under a provisional agreement. And then I think we became fully functional in 1973. So I will say Karen Gatovy was our first president back in 1971. And she shared with us that they had three different causes that they were most interested in, and racism was one of them, and it was the top one. And she herself was part of that and working to be an anti-racist before anti-racist was really coined as a term. So that is part of the change that had started to take place. And so it's amazing to me. So I look at those 50-year marks, and I want to come up to our 50-year mark. Last year, it was really impressed upon us, as things happened with George Floyd, that and in our community, we certainly had things come up with coup d'etat and folks understanding and learning more about the Wilmington Massacre. Certainly Wilmington Lie had come out and now certainly won the Pulitzer Prize, which we're very proud of David Zigrino for that. But an awakening of that awareness has really begun. And I almost want to call it a civil rights movement 2.0 is happening in this time right now. And as we looked at it, there was an opportunity for us to be present at the sit-in at the Hugh McCrae Park, where we were wanting to change the name of the park and get rid of monuments and make those stands. And so as a representative of the league and also as a representative of the ERA NC Alliance, I was able to make a speech and talk about what the statements were from both of those organizations about the commitment that we would have to being anti-racist and to do the work and to show up. And so we've done a lot of intentional work since then, certainly. And I wanted to just show a cute little picture here. This is our co-president, Bridget Tarrant. She's in there as well. And you showed earlier a picture of Rebecca Trammell, who is my friend. And that day she didn't recognize me because I was dressed like this. And you know, here we are as a sit-in at the park, and I was getting ready to do my speech. And she said she didn't recognize me till I got up to speak. She said, I just looked at you and I thought, well, here comes Susan B. Anthony coming to give this talk. So, but then she said the words were powerful and that it really meant a lot to have that commitment. And then we have been working very hard to put words into actions, especially since that time. And so we do take a very big part in a lot of things that are happening in our community. And for us, it's been about doing the internal work and adopting our diversity, equity, inclusion policy, and doing a lot of internal work inside our processes that we do here at the League. But also to how are we community partners? How are we best community partners here? And a lot of that is about showing up. It's about asking what is needed, and to say, instead of just saying, here, we're here to save the day, it's more of a, how can we be of service? And I think that that's really been a change of the approach in this continuum of change, and just understanding, I think that's Maya Angelou said, when you know better, you do better. And I think that that's been the commitment that we put forward. And then now we're able to do a full committee for diversity, equity, inclusion for the entire state. And so that's been an important step for us, as all of our local leagues have gathered together and are having these conversations. It starts with conversations. It starts with education for yourself, and then moving into being better partners in our community. And I'm not going to say that that park was a full circle moment for us, because it certainly is not a full circle, because that would diminish the part where we consider it to be a process of change. So it's not a complete circle. We're just moving forward from there. So that's what I have to say. And I know we're right at 1 o'clock, and I want to be able to have a closing word from each one of you. So if you can take one more minute and say goodbye to us. And if there was anything more that you wanted to say, I'm so sorry, everyone, that we didn't have time for questions. We certainly had a lot to say.
Yes, there is a question that just came up in the chat about what's happening in the local schools about teaching 1898. And I will tell you that Cedric Harrison's group, Support the Port, and his new enterprise called Wilmington in Color is producing coloring books that commemorates Black history here in Wilmington. And it includes 1898 historical events and pages of coloring so that the students can learn about the history in an age-appropriate way. So that's one effort. And then there are other schools that are building a curriculum around 1898. And then there's more to be done, though. It's not done yet. So keep making sure that it is in the schools where you have children or grandchildren. And thank you all very much for listening.
We appreciate you very much. Well, I think that's about all we have, unless Cynthia's on here and wants to say goodbye.
I just want to say thank you again and goodbye to everyone. Hopefully not goodbye, but until the next time, whether it's a community event or a webinar or whatever, I hope you all continue to fight the good fight and continue to remember the future, because it's what we do today that can make an impact on the children who will be us on another day in time.
Yeah, I think we believe that. Thank you all for all of your attention today. And certainly if you have questions that we weren't able to get to, give us an email. I'll put my email in the chat really quickly, and you can reach out to us that way. Thank you. Oops, appreciate you. Actually, I spelled my own name wrong. All right, thank you all.